added to farmlands from external sources. When we come to natural farming, neither chemical nor organic fertilizers are added to the soil. In fact, no external fertilizers are added to soil or given to plants whatsoever. So we feel that there are a lot of challenges when we are talking about all these farming systems. Second point, when we come to organic farming, it still requires basic agro practices like plowing, tilting, mixing of manures, weeding, etc. to be performed. Whereas in natural farming, decomposition of organic matter it is taking a very important step in the farming, and which has to be by microbes and earthworms. It is being encouraged right on the soil surface itself, which gradually adds nutrition in the soil. When we come to the third point, organic farm is still expensive due to requirement of bulk manures. Okay, so we are taking external resources, and therefore it is considered to be little expensive as compared to natural farming, since it has an ecological impact on surrounding environments. Whereas natural agriculture, it is an extremely low cost farming method, completely molding, and there is no plowing, no tilling of soil, no fertilizer, no weeding is done, just the way it is would be in the natural ecosystem. So see, when we are comparing these two definitions, we are now very well clear the natural and organic farming systems are totally different. Now, as a plant pathologist, as a microbiologist, or as a biological scientist, we are very much concerned about the indigenous microorganism. We are very much concerned about the effective microorganism. Now, before we go into that, we really need to understand what is the basic difference between the IMOs and the EMs, because these are the two important definitions which are really highly related with our both the agri farming systems. So, what are indigenous microorganisms? They are the group of innate
Okay, ma'am.
microbial consortium which
Please
live
little
in the
slower.
soil and surfaces of all living things inside and outside, which have the potentiality in biodegradation, bioleaching, biocomposting, nitrogen fixation, improving soil fertility, and as well as in the production of plant growth hormones. So these are the IMOs. Effect, on the other hand, are the laboratory cultured mixture of microorganisms. The main difference that divides these two ideas is that IMOs are naturally made, while EMs are man-made. But these two are very much the same with one another in all aspects. Basically, the other microorganisms, of course, whatever we are doing working, we are taking the help from the nature itself. There are some very important uh, there have been people who have been working on indigenous microorganisms, and there are some cases reported from outside, like Dr. Cho Hankyo in 1960s. They were working with the IMOs. Now you will all will try to understand that how they were culturing them. They were taking some wooden boxes filled with the rice or brown sugar and rice bran, wheat meal, and mixing with the clay soil and taking different types of material and making the potting soil. Then these were actually they were also taking the fermented plant juices. Then for water soluble calcium, they took eggshells, fish amino acids. So these are some of the resources which people have used for the natural farming system. And they for water soluble calcium phosphate, they made it from animal bones. So I think the natural resources have been used for developing these indigenous microorganisms, because ultimately we all know microorganisms are very important in every aspect of our life. Now, what is biointensive disease management? Now, whenever we are going into, now we have understood that microorganisms are very important, both natural and organic farming systems, whether in the form of IMs or EMs. Now, when we are coming to disease management, now since being a plant pathologist, now my major concern is how we really take care of the crop. Now, crop protection is a very important subject. When we have to take care from the pest management, we have to be very clearly defined management practices for the biointensive disease management or pest management. So biointensive are the ones which are designated or related to an organic approach to intensive agri or horticulture, which seeks to obtain the greatest possible crop yields from the smallest possible areas by sustainable means. So actually, everywhere yield is definitely very important for all of us, but we need to have this biointensive organic approach. In this system, we need to approach the pest management based on the understanding of pest ecology. And therefore we need to accurately diagnose the nature and source of pest problem, rely on the range of preventive tactics and biological controls to keep pest populations within the acceptable limits. Before we go into the details, why when we are talking about the management, since the subject is of the concern that we have to take care of the crops in the organic and the this thing, how we are really going to get the results out of it? What is that basic resources actually? What is that basic substrate where we are going to use this micro? It is the soil actually, and soil microbiome are playing a very very important role when it comes to the plants and soil, since here is the source, here is the area where we find bacteria, archaea, fungi, and we have the potential for beneficial and harmful effects on plant growth and crop yield. And soil microbiome actually it is responsible for biogeochemical cycling of micronutrients, elements vital for the growth of plants and animal life. And therefore, when the plants are co-evolved with microbes and plant genotypes that supported microbiome, they increase their own health likelihood a fitness advantage under natural selection. Plant domestication and crop breeding under fertilizations have largely decoupled the rhizosphere microbiome from the plant selection. The root microbiome effects on the plant health. How it is that because the root microbiome on the plant has been found in mostly very well clearly evidenced in the disease suppressive soils. When we find the disease suppressive soils, then we have find some of the soils are very very important, and we find there is a very low microbial content. I mean low pathogenic population. And this, since we know rhizosphere, it is a very important area where there is a fierce battle going on between the microorganisms competing for the plant derived nutrients. So most soil-borne pathogens they need to grow saprophytically in the rhizosphere to reach the host, and for reaching them it has to develop sufficient numbers, and so then only they can infect the host tissue and they effectively escape the rhizosphere battle zone. So if they are able to multiply themselves, that means it is favorable for them. But if it is not, that means somewhere the pathogen population is suppressed. So this is actually the whole game of our soil microbiota, the root microbiota, the rhizosphere, and therefore these microbiomes or the soil microbiome all are very very important. And therefore every natural soil which has the ability to suppress a pathogen to a certain extent, it can be deduced from the disease severity following pathogen inoculation in pastoral soil. So of course many experiments have been done, and we know all this very very importantly, that how plant microbe interactions in the rhizosphere and phyllosphere is important. The plant growth promoting microbes, they are attracted to the rhizosphere and phyllosphere by root and leaf exudates. So these studies are very, very importantly when we are coming to the basic side. We really need a student has to really understand, and the young scientists who are working on such type of problems, they really need to understand that how there is an attraction of these growth promoting microbes through the root and the leaf exudates. In return, they make nutrients which are available to plants, control pathogens or influence plant development, disease resistance, and stress resilience by manipulating the soil microbiota. And we can see here, as you see in the diagrammatic presentation, also the rhizosphere, plant growth promoting rhizobacteria, fungal and endophytes, mycorrhiza, how they are also very influencing in root pathogens and leaf pathogens. There are mechanisms like systemically acquired resistance, which help in developing the resistance in the plant, and plant priming conditions induce systemic resistance are also there when it comes to the rhizosphere. So we have the different mechanism in the plant system which help further. So we find that the management practices they influence the soil microbiome. Therefore, we need to have to understand these farm management practices, which, as I referred earlier, like organic and natural farming. So our management practices have to be fully understood, and we need to understand by in organic or conventional system, the organic farming it is based on the minimal use of the farm inputs and on management practices which restore, maintain, and enhance the ecological harmony. Whereas organic farming uses no synthetic fertilizer or additive to increase productivity, conventional farming does just the opposite, often using synthetic chemical fertilizer and pesticides to benefit crop protection and productivity. So there is a very clear-cut difference between this, and therefore the choice of the farming practices. When we have to choose this, we have to understand the different processes, the steps to achieve a more diverse and even micromanagement. So therefore, I had tried to explain all these factors, that how our management practices will lead to understand this organic as well as the natural farming. Now, there are different methods for the plant health management. There may be modification in cultural practices. There will be mechanical destruction of the source of inoculum, then clean cultivation, use of organic amendments, developing the pesticides of organic origin, encouraging the biocontrol agents, and some cultural practices like cover and trap crops, heat treatment, cold temperatures, solar energy, they all can be conveniently used to manage the disease incidence below the economic injury level under organic farming. So it is not only disease incidence, I would say pest management as such. So we need to have that economic injury level under the organic farming system. So, which microorganisms are playing very important? So, plant growth promoting fungi and plant growth promoting bacteria are playing very, very important role now in our agriculture system, and they are actually very important microorganisms which enter the root system of the host and enhance the beneficial effects within endophytic lifestyle. Then, very importantly, today we know biological products are biofertilizers, biostimulants, biopesticides. Biofertilizers, you all know microbials, which are needed to enhance the plant nutrient uptake from the soil. Biostimulants enhance the nutrition efficiency, abiotic stress tolerance, or crop quality traits, regardless of its nutrient contents. And what are biopesticides? They are derived from natural materials such as plants, fungi, bacteria, and certain minerals. So biopesticides, they target a specific pest and they inherently less toxic. They are inherently less toxic and then synthetic pesticide. So these are the major biological products which are playing very, very important role in both the organic and the natural farming system. You all will be happy to know now we have a multifaceted role of some of the biological control agents in natural and organic farming system. Like very important, like Trichoderma species, Pseudomonas species, Aspergillus species, Mycorrhiza, Metarhizium. We various some of the very important and plant growth promoting rhizobacteria. So, as I explained earlier also, this application of IMOs or EMOs, how we can manipulate, we can remold them, we can utilize them, we can make a very good package of them through development of biofertilizers, then biocomposting, bioleaching, bioremediation, biodegradation. Because if we really need to save our all that systems, as I explained earlier, in both the organic and the natural form. Now, what are the major components of natural farming? We have to really understand very nicely. Because, like as I explained in organic farming, everything is well understood. We have understood like this, I have already explained PGPF and PGPRs are playing very, very important role in organic farming system. When it comes to natural farming, we are bound to actually use some very, very important ingredients like cow dung, cow urine, that all which is available in the farm actually, pulses, jaggery concoction. Then like we have to use such type of systems. So there are many products nowadays which are already being referred on the Niti Aayog portal. Jivamrit, Bijamrit, plant protection, Vapasa, mulching. Even when as a plant pathologist, when I was studying this and I've tried to understand, and even since now after my retirement, I've tried to develop some very important biological products also, and we are also working on the natural farming products. We are also working and trying to find out whether how much effective are they. So we found that after compilation of all literature, we found that some of the very important ingredients for plant protection practices in natural farming are all a very natural. I mean, the available in the available to the farmers are cow dung, cow urine, lime, jaggery, pulses, flour, neem leaves, currant leaves, custard apple leaves, datura leaves, mango leaves, tobacco powder, green chili, garlic paste, turmeric powder, ginger paste, asafoetida, milk, curd, etc. Now, these products purposely I wanted all of you to know so that you can really have a picture, a very clear picture of all these things. And so while we are, I know some of the students I've seen in agriculture university, also botany departments and various other pests, even in entomology and other, when people are working on the natural products, they are also working on the plant products, and how well all these products have to be integrated. Now the time has come, whosoever has conducted such type of research, we really need to be very careful before we release our results, that are we really giving the results which are helping our farmers. Are they helping in the long run? Are they helping in the field? Because any research which is just being worked out in the lab, we may not be able to help. Because now if we have to really give an alternative practice to the farmers, our results have to go into the fields. So for the students as well as for our other young scientists and other faculty members, I've tried to just highlight some research work done on this, especially because there may be highly big confusion that uh, is natural farming going to really improve the soil properties? Does the zero budget natural farming will really give us some results? So, keeping these such types of questions in mind, one of the papers I've seen 2023, see, these questions are occurring in a lot of agriculture scientists and agriculture university. So, not it is like this that we are professing it, or we are recommending it right now. You start doing these things till you're really confident about it. That how Jivamrit, which is cow dung and urine based formulation, can it help us in increasing the organic carbon? So in this particular paper they have shown that from 0.61% it could increase to 0.7. Similarly, average organic carbon was recorded and micronutrients were also increased. So this increase in micronutrients and organic carbon gives us a hope that our micro this practice may lead us to some results. And some genome metagenomic analysis revealed that proteobacteria were dominantly present, and bacterial phyla, including Bacillus, Pseudomonas, Rhizobium, and Bacillus, they were present there. And Ascomyta was the dominating fungi phyla present in the soil. So such type of results are allowing us to understand, and therefore this particular publication, Sahara et al. 2023 in Agriculture MTPI, they have published this. They have provided a new proof of concept and understanding of the potential of the zero budget natural farming, how it can improve the soil properties. Okay. Now there is another Smith et al. 2020 natural sustainability. This paper was published. I purposely have brought to all of you, for all of you, that you all can read whenever you get time. Then and try to like understand also that how that these can challenge to scale up the zero budget natural farming. So in Andhra Pradesh alone, 13% of the productive agriculture area now is just going to zero budget natural farming. So means there are section of the farmers who are trying to do this. And today, if I have taken this topic. It is just not. It is just to understand the difference between them and how it is going on, and what is since it is a 20-minute, 20-25 minutes time. I'm just trying to briefly, like, I mean, it may be, I mean, I want to give the presentation in time only, so that, like, we can really understand what is going on in our country and how people are doing it. So it is to, again, they have also said the soil degradation. Then, even with the maximum potential nitrogen fixation release, only 50 to 80% of the national average nitrogen applied as fertilizer expected to be supplied. Keeping all this in view, that zero budget land, we need to be very careful because we don't want to reduce our productivity also. So, the work was done on Bijamrit, Dhrav Jivamrit, and Ghana Jivamrit, and all nitrogen content in the inoculum is assumed to be available to the. It is assumed actually, and so they 50% the potential maximum fixation by Jivamrit is assumed. No extra manure is added. So we have to be really careful before we give such type of recommendations. So what can be the challenges actually, and how we can improve upon, like when we are talking about whole system, we need to have the survey of impacts on farm income. We need to survey of practices. We need to understand controlled, replicated, and randomized trials. We should have these type of trials. We should be really very careful before releasing the results. We need to understand the what is the impact on the earth forms, on the other soil fauna, the cycling of the nutrients. Then all these things, like whether it is Jivamrit, soil inoculum, or it is Bijamrit, or mulching, or soil aeration, all have to be really taken in care, where we have to understand what is the impact of the on the microorganisms, the earthworm activity. Because if in natural farming we are taking these things into view, we need to have some study on the impact, and we really also need to understand, can we really increase our soil organic with the incorporation of crop residues in such type of geomil treated soil. So after going through all these concepts, I would just that what are the basic is that points which are emerging out of it. The development of disease suppressive soils following successive seasons of crop monoculture definitely suggests that we should have the beneficial soil microbial communities, which should be introduced into our soils, so that there is a there is a increase in the microbial activity, and more of the microbial activity we may be able to refer to the relationship to plant health and productivity. Then multipartite interactions that lead to assembly and maintenance of the root microbiome, they are highly complex and we need to fully understand. Okay. Then there is a greater understanding of root microbiome community dynamics. We need to understand that. And therefore there has to be a good communication going on, a potential, and there should be since there is an untapped resource, large resource, so we have to understand that also. We conclude that a systems approach to disease management is required, and that interdisciplinary research is needed to solve lingering disease problems or pest management problems or the yield problem, especially for the natural farming and the organic farming in the tropics. Some of the organic regulations are in need of revision in close collaboration with various stakeholders. We really need to understand that some of the zero budget natural farming systems or natural farming system, they need to really improvise, or they can remodify, and they can be modified by introduction of the microorganisms properly, so that we are not only depending on the introduced ones, not only depending on the EMs, only effective microorganisms, only on the IMs that is introduced, already induced there. We need to also develop the effective microorganisms. We can introduce the effective microorganisms, and therefore then we can be very, very well able to understand all this thing. So coming to the end of my topic, I think I have already taken more than 20 minutes, 2 minutes more. So okay, thank you very much. Since this is the International Year of Millets, I have given one where I told that if we are starting with the millet production with the in the beginning itself. I think if in the beginning itself this cropping system is well understood, then I think the researches will be very, 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 very effective. And then we can have, then we know that what we have to develop and what. So we may not be so much scared of the reducing yields and all that. So as such, I just want to introduce that we are working on Trichoderma herzianum. We are working on the soil organic carbon detection kit. I'm working on microfine neem biopesticide. Then I'm also working on the natural farming products, the Jivamrit, Bijamrit, Dhanamrit, many products, and we are also developing the decomposers for the different systems, for the both organic and natural farming systems. So in the end, I thank the Vice Chancellor of the LN Mithila University, Darbhanga, Bihar, who for giving me this dais and this forum to speak on this particular subject. I'm highly thankful to the head division of Botany department, and also the organizing secretary and the organizing committee of the international conference on the recent trends and future process in food and healthy
Thank you
food.
very much. You
Thank you.
have very specifically said about the role of biochemicals in our organic and natural flower farming. Thank you very much. Now,
Thank
the audience, if you have any question, okay.
Thank you, madam. Thank you.
Thank you. Ma'am, I just want to ask a very layman's question. Whether
I think
environmental factors have some say on the role of biologicals in organic and natural farming, as temperature, if they're working, speed or something, has any kind of work done in this direction? Okay, madam. It is
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
okay. Thank you very much. Yeah. Now, the next speaker is Mr. Saqib Nami. Topic is challenges and remedial measures of food security in Nepal. Mr. Saqib Nagi is country director from a German NGO called Well Under High Life in Nepal. He is a development and humanitarian professional with around 20 years of experience in South and Southeast Asia. He has visited more than 50 countries. He has been country head Action Aid International Bangladesh. He has expertise in strategic leadership food system transformation, institution building, thought leadership, change process, and resource mobilization. He had MBA from Indian Institute of Forest Management, Bhopal, Masters in International Development Management from England, and also Masters in Humanitarian Action from University of Groningen, Netherlands. He has worked in emergencies like Gujarat earthquake, Indian tsunami, and Rohingya crisis, focusing mostly on food security, livelihoods, and enterprise promotion, climate change, and resilience. Now, Mr. Sakib Nabi.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, you are audible.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm just trying to share my screen now. Is it, my screen is visible now? Is okay?
Yes,
Okay, thank you. I mean, it's a pleasure to be here and talking to esteemed colleagues from
wait,
Ellen Mithila
your
University.
screen is, excuse me, sir, screen is not visible.
Screen is not visible, right?
Then I am handing it to my technician.
Can somebody grant me the permission to share the screen now?
Permission is
Yeah, it's granted, isn't it? So can you see my screen now? Is it visible?
no, sir. No.
Not yet.
Please share, sir, again. Not share.
So what I'm doing, your entire screen
Up
is
mark,
a,
that mark, sir. Up arrow mark. Present now.
no, right. So how do I do it then? I'm trying to do this screen share from the bottom. There is an arrow. I'm clicking on the entire screen share,
Yes.
but again, it's not coming. Is there a reason behind it?
First we open the PPT, sir. Then
Yeah,
share.
the PPT is open now. Is it better? Can you see my screen now?
No, no, sir.
Not yet.
No, sir.
Hmm. Just give me a moment then. Is it okay if I share my presentation through an email and somebody can upload it?
Yes, sir. The
I'm
text box
quickly,
is not email.
if you can share the email with me in the chat box here. Can somebody share the email with me in the chat box?
Yes, yes, sir.
Mm, mm. Oh, even chat isn't available. I think it's, is it possible? Shall I share my, wait,
Please share this.
so, okay, DDEDBG, right?
Yes.
At gmail.com, right?
Yes, yes.
So I've sent the presentation to you. It's 8 MB. Let me know when you get it, then you can share the screen also. Just give me a moment. Did you get the presentation, sir?
No, sir.
Yes, now you got it.
Yes.
So if you can open the presentation, then I can ask you to turn off the, keep on changing the slides also. Let me know when once the presentation is ready, sir. So just to kind of, I mean, before you upload the presentation, I will be focusing on how we are addressing food security in Nepal. And is it okay to start now? Yes, this I can. So shall I start now? Is it okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So my presentation, first and foremost, I would like to thank the organizer for giving me the opportunity to talk about how we address food security in Nepal. And this presentation will be focusing more on, as from the perspectives of an implementer or the people working on the ground. I mean, I feel that, I mean, this presentation very well complements the presentation which was done by Dr. Pratibha Sharma. She has talked a lot about how do we need to shift from a commercial agriculture to more of an organic agriculture or a regenerative agriculture, which is more feasible in the region meaning India, Nepal, Bangladesh and all, because 80% of our farmers are mostly smallholders or marginal farmers. So the possibility of having a commercial agriculture, industrial agriculture, is not that much as compared to having an agriculture which is focusing on precision agriculture, which is focusing on looking at the needs and aspiration of the smallholder farmers. And she has also talked about one of the things that if we have to promote food security through agriculture, we have to focus on the whole of systems approach. And that's what exactly my presentation is going to be focusing on. Can you go to the next slide, please? So just wanted to give you a brief update about who we are. We are called Welthunger Hilfe. It's one of the largest NGO of Germany, which was established in 1962. And it was started under the umbrella of a food and agriculture organization through a global campaign to end hunger. So we work in around 34 countries right now, and our total portfolio is around 320 million euros annually. Over to next slide, sir. Yes, I mean, this is our theory of change, that we believe in one planet, zero hunger. We believe in equity. We believe in reducing the gap between the rich and the poor. And if you look at our vision, I have highlighted two words over there: hunger and poverty, which is our core programming principle. So our entire work, wherever we work globally, has to be focusing on hunger and poverty and how it interrelates with each other. Next slide, please. I'll give you a brief update about the contextual update about Nepal. So, I mean, if you look at a very interesting picture which I have shared. This is from one of the communities in Nepal and the way they traditionally preserve food. This photo was taken in the middle Himalayas, around 2000 to 3000 meter above sea level. So, I mean, what we want to say that the community has their own way of ensuring food security. They has their own way of preserving the food and ensuring the food security of the people. One of the things which is very prominent about Nepal is that it's a country of around 27 to 28 million, but there are 126 ethnic communities, which means there is a lot of diversity within Nepal. And the reason why we wanted to highlight this, that if we have to focus on any interventions, it has to be focusing on the diversity within the community also. What we want to say is that we cannot have one principle across all the communities, and we need to respect their needs and aspirations also. There has been some political instability, I'm sure you all know about it, And one of the factors which we feel is impacting Nepal a lot is its graduation from least developing countries (LDC) to middle income countries, which means once Nepal graduates, which is happening in 2026, there will be lots of political and economic implications associated with it in terms of, I would say, the export and import concessions, the privileges that the country gets when it is an LDC. And there's something called the Grand Bargain and Charter for Change, which is happening globally, which focuses on, you know, uh, uh, elaborating our interventions as close as possible to the communities also. I just wanted to highlight also that in terms of the foreign assistance, around 24% of the national budget, which is very, very high, is through the ODA assistance. And out of that, 21% comes at grants. And then again, what are the key priorities of the donors? USAID around 105 million annually, UK 45 million, and sector-wise allocation is that agriculture continues to be a top priority, which means there is a huge need to promote agriculture because of the insecurity, food insecurity in Nepal. Over to the next slide, please. I also wanted to highlight some of the issues related with the socio-economic condition. There's something called the Human Development Index. Nepal is 143 out of 191, which is moderate. But when you factor in the inequality, the SDI further loses 25%, which means Nepal is a country with high discrimination, high gender discrimination, and ethnicity discrimination also. The moment you factor in gender, the HDI comes down drastically. Then again, it has a very high rate of unemployment, around 11%, among some of the top countries in the world. Agriculture is the main source of livelihoods, with 70% of the population dependent on the agriculture. But if you look at the way it contributes to the GDP, it just contributes one third, which means agriculture, 70% of the people are associated with it, but it is not been a very productive sector. So this gives us the opportunity to focus more on that. There is something called GHI, Global Hunger Index, which is a report published by us, and which says that in terms of scoring coming out of hunger, Nepal has been progressing gradually, but in terms of its rating, it's going down, which means overall the food security and hunger index globally is improving, but at the same time, Nepal is not able to keep pace with the global pace. COVID 19, I'm sure you all know the impact of COVID-19 on the socio-economic, fabrics, enterprise, work, migration, and all. I don't want to elaborate much on it. One interesting fact which I want to talk about is that when we talk about water, 71% of all and 91% of the sources used by the poor, 91% of the sources used by poor are contaminated. And still there are 16% of the population which practices open defecation, which means there is a lack of toilet facilities. In terms of migration, very interesting figure, remittance contributes to around 25% of the GDP. The total population, I repeat again, Nepal is around 22.8 to 29 million, but there are figures which says that people, the Nepali diaspora out of the country is between 6 to 11 million, which is a very, very high number. And out of this, 75% of the people who migrate for work or because of the impact of climate change, 75% are unskilled. Climate risk, I don't have to elaborate on it further. It's one of the climate vulnerable countries, and it is further going down. It's further escalating. The impact of climate change is further escalating also. Can we go to the next slide, please, quickly? Yes, I mean, the population we target, I want to focus over there. We says that, as I said, that around 6 to 20% of the people migrate out of the country. These are mostly men, 90% of the men. So the burden on ensuring food security and agriculture is on women now. We see lots of feminization of agriculture, which means earlier the female used to take care of the household work. Now the female is the breadwinner also. They are taking care of the livelihoods of the family also. Again, some of the figures is that the farms managed by women produce less as compared to the farms managed by men. Women in agriculture labor receive 26% less wage as compared to men. We are saying at one point in time that feminization of agriculture is happening. At the same time, we see a huge disparity between the engagement of men and women in agriculture in terms of payment, in terms of their contribution, and in terms of women being recognized as a farmer. There are many countries in the world where the women are not recognized as the farmer. So what we are saying that in order to address food security and hunger, we have to focus on landless laborers, smallholder farmers, women, youth, and migrants. Migrants including the people who are coming back from abroad. Next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide? And this is our theory. I mean, I'll not go to get into it, but the focus is around food systems approach, which means we look at the entire value chain, but at the same time, we look at various actors engaged in the value chain and how they interplay or intersect with each other, or what are the dynamics between various actors in the value chain. That's our focus. I'll go into the details into the next slide now. Next slide, please. So in terms of program, what we are saying is that we have to work in future. We have to focus on the food systems approach, systems thinking approach. Then there are various system thematic areas like agriculture, like enterprise promotion, right? Green job, green development, migration, climate change, that we have to integrate and come out with a very comprehensive approach to address food systems. We also feel that, I mean, we have seen the disparity between men and women. We have also seen the disparity between various intersecting identities also, based on ethnicity, religion, caste, and all. We say that food system has to be equitable, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. And then we also focuses on global standards, learn from, if you know, FAO, learn from various research institution, and how do we ensure that these are incorporated into our work. We need to focus a lot on understanding the urban context, because we see that the poverty is increasing in urban areas as compared to the rural areas. And we also feel that the development actors are not able to understand the urban areas as they're understanding the rural areas also. This is because of urbanization, this is because of migration, this is because of the preference of the people to shift from rural areas to urban areas, for the lack, for the lack of opportunity they have, employment, education. There are lots of factors which is leading towards it. Next one, please. Next slide. Yes, I mean, this is the map which is produced by FOA every year. It's called Food Security Atlas. So in order to ensure that we are addressing the food security, we need to focus on those areas which are food insecure, which has high rate of undernutrition. So right now we are focusing on the three provinces in the west, which is Sudur Pashchim, Karnali, and Lumbini province, and one province which is very close at the bottom towards the southern part of Nepal, which is called Madhes province. So we have to be very focused if we want to, in terms of selecting the geographical area, if to have to address food security and nutrition. Next slide, please. Next, please. Can you go to the next slide? Yes, I mean, next again, one more. Yeah. So we are saying that we need to focus on systems approach, which means if we are designing, the one step is that project may be responding to the need but not informed by systems thinking. If we advance for one more step further, then it's that project is responding to a specific gap, and the ultimate stage is that project is addressing key levers to transfer systems malfunction. Inclusive multiple stakeholders project design is informed by systems analysis. So these are the various three steps through which we do analysis of the project, and the ultimate is that we reach step 3 from step 1, graduate from step 1 to step 3. Next slide, please. Yes. So we are saying that our ambition is to have a sustainable and resilient food system to nourish safe and healthy diets at all the times. I mean, I'm sure you would have seen the definition from Dr. Pratibha Sharma, so I'm not going to repeat it again. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yes, I mean, if you're talking about the systems thinking approach in addressing food security and nutrition, and we talk about transformation, who transform to what end is important, transformation for whom, and transformation with whom. When we say transformation with whom, it means that who are our partners in changing the food system. Transformation for who, meaning who are the people for whom we need to work, and the transformation to what extent is that, to what degree we need to transform it. Next slide. Go ahead, please. Next. That this is what I said. I mean, you can see it in the picture. And again, as an organization, we need to understand what our role is, whether we are the contributor to the food systems, whether we are a facilitator, or whether we are an implementer. Based on our definition, our positioning, it depends what kind of interventions we need to focus on. Next, please. Next. Can you go to the next slide? One more. One back. Back. Go back, please. Go back. Go back. Back, not front. Back. One more back. One more. So this is our sustainable. Yeah, yeah. That one. So these are our four. Can you go to the next one? Just one, so that we can see the round circle also. Yes. So these are four key levers in understanding sustainable and resilient food systems. We focus on sustainable livelihoods. We focus on sustainable and resilient agriculture. We focus a lot on resilience because of the impact of climate change. We focus on lot on responsive government, and then the connectivity. Next slide, please. In terms of sustainable and resilient agriculture, what Dr. Sharma is saying, soil health, agriculture, yield and efficiency, nutrition sensitive agriculture. It should not be commercial, but it should look at what is the food deficit within the community, what kind of food, and then based on that we program agriculture. And then again, farm diversification. These are the four key focus areas in terms of agriculture. Next, sustainable livelihoods. Next, please, slides, please. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So we are talking about connectivity. Yes. Yes. Empowerment of the local layer. We are talking a lot about governance, because it's not about giving the food to the community, but at the same time, how do we engage the community with other stakeholders in the decision making process. Next slide. This is the overall system approach that we focus on. Can we go to the next slide now, please? Because we don't have much time. I don't want to. Yes, I mean, there are three types of approaches we have. Go click two times more, please. One is that the system thinking, which is stagnating. We keep on working there, we don't see much changes. Then there is one incremental, and the third one is disruptive and transformative, which brings drastic food systems impact over a period of time. So we have to focus on incremental actions then, and there are some components related with incremental actions, which if you can click one more time, then we can see it. Next slide. One more. Yes. So these are some of the key components which can lead to incremental actions and then further lead to disruptive actions as well. Next. Program, I've already talked about. We want to have a very comprehensive approach. We want to focus on resilience. And then again, one of the key components, when we say that we feel that this poor in the urban areas are going to increase much more as compared to rural areas. So we have to understand urban poverty and hunger also. Next slide. Yes. I mean, we need to focus a lot on advocacy, which means whatever we do on the ground, we ensure that the government buys it and it becomes a part of their policy programming. Right now, there's a province in Nepal called Karnali, and it has been declared as an organic province. So we are working very closely with the government. What does organic province mean and how it needs to be rolled out in Karnali? Then again, very important is that how do we use digital transformation or the digital ecosystem to enhance systems thinking approach. Next please. Yeah, this is a short glimpse, just two pictures of these women again in Karnali in a place called Srinagar. These women and the men with her, their couple, they were going to Malaysia for work as a laborer. But again, based on the interaction with them, what we have started something is called the green college over here in some of the provinces, which focuses on how do we make agriculture more sustainable, how do we green the entire agriculture approach. And this woman was engaged with her husband, and now she is a big entrepreneur. She has been raising nursery and selling saplings to the people over there. So, I mean, this is one of the way wherein we are addressing food security and nutrition, at the same time also trying to discourage migration. Next slide. Again, from the same community, if you'll see the picture, I mean, my interaction with these people, this is around 2,500 meters above sea level. And the last one slide, please. Last slide. Uh, Next slide. This is a very positive picture. I think that is still people in the higher. Go to the last slide, please. Yes, I mean, I still say some conventional way of farming happening in the interior part of Nepal, which gives us hope to ensure that, we promote organic cultivation. We focus a lot on regenerative agriculture, which means we we direct the agriculture in such a way that it takes care of the health needs of the soil as well as the water. Thanks for the time. I would especially want to thank the organization, the organizers of this event, with all the protocols followed, and to Haja Slauddin also, who interacted with me and gave me a solid understanding about this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Saqib Nabi. You have very nicely, your topic was very popular. Everyone can understand it, and you narrated very nicely about the remedial measures are being taken for the food security in Nepal. Now, my chairman has got one question. Will
Thank
you
you.
answer it?
Yes, I'm happy to answer it if I'm able to hear it properly, or if I'm not able to hear it, can somebody type
Okay,
it in
go
the chat
over
box?
with you now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
One term that digital ecosystem. What it has been? The digital ecosystem.
Digital ecosystem we are talking about, like, I mean, we see a huge penetration of mobile technologies now, right, sir? So right now we see that is there a way wherein the power of mobile technology could be harnessed to could be exploited properly to enhance agriculture productivity, to connect the farmers with the market also, sir. Right now what is happening is that we see lots of communities are producing organic food, but they don't have the avenues or the ways to connect with the market wherein they can sell their product at a premium rate, sir. So whether we develop some apps, whether how do we connect the farmers with the market, whether we can use this mobile technology. I can give you an example of Myanmar also, sir, where I was working, and I saw that there is a digital tool which measures the health of the soil, and based on that exact amount of fertilization is recommended, which means that the farmer is saving on money. They are not using excess fertilizer, at the same time knows the exact health of the soil and what kind of a crop is more appropriate for that. And these people who are using this tool and they go from village to village. We call them the barefoot agriculture experts, sir. So they are an entrepreneurs in themselves also, that they are providing these services to the community, at the same time getting certain amount of money paid for the services, sir. That's it.
Thank you very much, Sakib sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank
Very
you.
good.
Thank you.
Now the next speaker. Now the next speaker is Dr. Hem Chandra Jha, Associate Professor, Department of Bioscience and Biomedical Institute of Science, Indore, India. Now a brief, now a brief I would like to say Dr. Hemchand Jha did his PhD in 2010 from Institute of Pathology in Delhi with Dr. Aruna Mittal, where he worked on molecular diagnosis and pathogenesis of chlamydia and pneumonia in coronary artery disease patients and awarded PhD from Birla Institute of Technology and Sciences, Pilani, Rajasthan. He then moved to University of Pennsylvania at Philadelphia for postdoctoral research, where he joined Professor S. Robertson Group working on tumor viruses, specifically EBF and ASHP. He has been working on understanding the role of EBF latent antigens in transformation of T cells by regulation of aurora kinase beta histone H2AX. He has done a lot of work, and his topic is role of bacteria and viruses in chronic diseases. Role of bacteria and viruses in chronic diseases. Dr. Hemchand Jha.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, organizing committee, vice chairman, sir. Uh, uh, I'm just trying to share my slides.
Hello. Yes.
Is the slide is visible now?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So once again, as my native place is Madhubani, and somehow I am not able to came at this time, but definitely I will try to join offline meeting next time. So the title of my presentation is infection and co-infection models of pathogens in chronic diseases. As just madam suggested that I work with the like bacteria, Chlamydia pneumoniae in my PhD, and then viruses, epistin virus, Kaposi sarcoma herpes virus at University of Pennsylvania, USA. And then in India, at IIT Indore, we are working with several viruses and bacteria. Like at IIT Indore with infection bioengineering group, and we are investigating the facets of the Epstein-Barr virus, an omnipresent virus that is responsible for various diseases. That it can be neurological modalities. So we are looking at multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer disease, gastric cancer progression also. Here we are looking the co-infection of Epstein-Barr virus and Helicobacter pylori. So Helicobacter pylori is the gut bacteria, gram-negative bacteria, and it has been seen that when the EBV and H. pylori have co-infection, then this is very aggressive, and they are drug resistant also. And then also we are looking the cerebral malaria with the co-infection with the Epstein-Barr virus and the Plasmodium falciparum. And recently we have also seen the SARS-CoV-2 biology, because I'm the virologist, so we are checking the like comorbidities like hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, and then with the gastric as well as the neurological compartment, and the various virus mutants. Like we know that Delta, Omicron, and various mutants, how much they are affecting, how which system, which body organelle, which part of the body organelle they are more efficient in the infection as well as disease causation, and then the phytochemicals like in Indian medicinal herbs, as well as the other outside of the Indian medicinal herbs, how they may get affected, like the kadha and many others. So what are the actually mechanism behind that? And then the machine learning also, because we are having collaboration, and then the ground glass opacity of the lung, because in the lung there are the patches, and so is that not only the manual, if we can measure by the machine learning and artificial intelligence tools, so those things we are working with that. Is my slides are moving? My slides are moving.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Time is limited, so I'm just going in the first part of my talk. That is, the epstein virus mediated neuroinflammation may lead to the multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's disease. So these are the group members, like PhD scholars and the collaborators from the India as well as the abroad. So why we are working with this epstein virus? Because there are hypotheses that this epstein virus may cause neuroinflammation, and that could be the three ways. Here the Roman, it is written in there 1, 2, and 3. So first way, it can go directly. This EBV can cross the, this is the blood-brain barrier, can cross the blood-brain barrier and can infect the like the pericytes with the astrocyte. And then it may cause the, basically these are the neurons basically, and it may cause the demyelination, and it cause the aggregation of the various virus as well as the host protein. So basically multiple sclerosis and the Alzheimer. Second way, as we all know that this virus is basically infecting the B cells, and then these are the infected B cells. It basically modulate these infected B cells and get enter through the blood-brain barrier inside the brain cells, and then there are cytokine storm. So various cytokines are secreted, and then they are also affected the microglia. This microglia is the we can say the immune cells of the brain, and then basically it affected again the neurons through the various secretions models. And then the third way, basically virus are not crossing the blood-brain barrier. It is basically infecting the our human T cells, and that B cells and T cells secrete various secretome, and that secretome through the various nerves as well as our peripheral nervous system, it is entering towards the brain cells, and that basically again leading to the cytokines and modulating various brain cells like astrocytes as well as the microglia, oligodendrocytes, and causing the disease. So these three are the basic models that is hypothesized, and in our lab at IIT Indore we have tested these three models through various biological as well as the biophysical, biochemical methods. So first methods, as we just shown, we are infecting this virus, like so we are isolating virus through the infection in the in vitro models of the epstein virus, and then we are infecting glial cells like astrocyte, microglia, and then blood-brain barrier cells as well as the neuronal cells, direct infection. Second way, we are taking the PBMC. This is the peripheral blood mononuclear cells, and then we are infecting with the virus, and then this infected PBMC we are co-culturing with the various compartment of the brain like glial cells, neural cells, uh, and then the third way where we are first infecting the PBMC. So how we are collecting the PBMC? Basically the healthy control, the people those are not having any symptoms or the disease conditions, we are isolating blood, drawing blood from there, and then isolating the PBMC in our lab, and then infecting the EBV. And then that EBV infected PBMC, basically we can say that it could be any organelle, and then that in the PBMC in the circulation, body circulation, and then that soup, infected soup, supernatant, or we can say the microenvironment, we are transferring to the glial cells and the neural cells. So basically when there is infection either in the gut or either in the stomach or in the lung, liver, or mouth, and that microenvironment through some secretome getting transferred to the brain cells, what could be the conditions? So all these three conditions we have tried to see and check, and then We have done the transcriptomic study through the real-time PCR, as well as the proteomics study through the Western blot and the immunofluorescence, and the physiological assay with the ethidium bromide and ecridine orange. So basically here we can see the all kind of apoptosis, that is like programmed cell death, and necrosis, that is a abrupted cell death, and then the DAPI here basically staining the nucleus, as well as the propydium iodide staining the apoptotic and the live cells. And then the wound healing assays. So wound healing is basically showing the cancerous property or the migration property of the cells and the invasion property. So these are the biological experiments usually people used to do in the in vitro labs. And then we have also seen through the Raman spectroscopy, because we all see just the in the SARS-CoV-2 this pandemic, that detecting the virus genes, and there is somewhat tedious, and it takes a lot of time to express the viral genes. So if we can have some biophysical method where the eruption of the biomolecular changes we can see in the early time point. So here we have seen the time point like 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hour to 96 hours. All these time points we collected after the infection, and then see that is that we can map the virus entry in the cells, as well as these are the DNA virus. So they go to the nucleus of the cells, and then start modifications, or the we can say the replication of the virus. So basically we also try to map the entry of the virus in the different cells like astrocyte, neural cells, microglia, and blood-brain barrier, and then there start the replication cycle. So in that way, which virus is infecting early, and which virus is infecting late, and which virus is not able to infect, as well as which virus start their replication early and which virus late, that we can map through this experiment, and we have done that. So this is the just a diagram where we have the cells, and then we are mapping from the, like we can say, the entry sites, like periphery sites, as well as from the nucleus sites also. And these are these kind of the spectra we are getting from 200 to the 4,000 nanometer from the various time points. And then if you draw the biomolecular changes from like 0 to 2 hour, 2 to 4 hour, 4 to 12 hour, 12 to 24 hour, 24 to 36 hours. So basically different time points, how these spectra is changing. So in that way we can map that which basically biomolecules are important in the entry of the virus, which biomolecules are important in the progression of the infection of the virus. So in that way we can block those molecules, or we can use those biomolecules as a therapeutic targets. So that is the actual the purpose of the study. So here just in the gist I wanted to show that when we have done microglia, that is the immune cells of the brain, astrocyte, that is one of the supporting cells of the brain, and neurons, that is the actual brain neural cells, and the endothelial, like the blood brain barrier endothelial cells. And then we have shown this Venn diagram, which component, which biomolecule are commonly taken to expressed by the EBV infection, and which one is the very specific. I'm not going in very detail in here, but I'm just showing some of the publication that we have published throughout this year in the next few slides. So the second is my slides are moving and visual. My slides are visual and I'm audible.
Yes, yes. Audio, video both.
Okay. So now the second project what I want to discuss here to investigate the aggregation potential of EBV proteins. We all know that aggregation of the viral protein or any protein like human protein is the hallmark of the Alzheimer's disease. So there are various reports available worldwide that these viruses may cause disease or may not cause disease. So we taken this challenge and then we started with all 110 EBV proteins and in the in silico study first. So we used here two software, Tango and AggregateSkin, and then we saw the aggregation properties of the virus proteins. And we found that, yes, one of the virus protein, that is the glycoprotein M, that peptide has 136 to 147, that is possibly making the oligomers as well as the aggregate also. But this is the in silico study, and we all know that we need to go for the in vitro as well as the in vivo also. So then we did some in vitro study like Congo red assay, thioflavin assay, atomic force microscopy, and cytotoxic assay. These are the in vitro assay, cell-based assay that we have done, and we have found that yes, in the Congo assay, this basically peptide is making the shift. So basically, it is the showing the aggregation property in the biophysical experiments, as well as in the thioflavin assay also, it is showing the that aggregation property, and that aggregation property how they are making, that is also looks like suitable through the atomic force microscopy. And is that these are the biophysical characteristics, but is that making something inside the cells also? Because we know that one of the hallmark of these aggregation properties, they are cytotoxic, because we all know that the beta 42 that is the one of the golden standard also have cytotoxicity. So we have seen here, yes, this is very high cytotoxic of this peptide uh, aggregation. uh, in the continuation of that, one paper just accepted last, where we have seen the seeding capacity of this peptide, and we have shown yes, it is not only the virus, other they are able to make any kind of aggregation like beta 42. This viral peptide is able to enhance that capacity. That paper just appeared last this week, actually yesterday, in ACS Chemical Neurosciences. And also I would like to mention it here that this work